My name is Valentina Cruz. I am 23 years old, and I used to believe that when your grandparents looked you in the eyes and said this is yours, that meant something permanent. I was wrong. My grandparents, Abuelo Rodrigo and Abuela Carmen, built their wealth the slow way. Abuelo came to the United States from Oaxaca in 1971 with $40 and a cousin's address written on a folded napkin. He found work in a machine shop in the San Fernando Valley, saved every dollar he didn't absolutely need, and by 1985 had purchased a small commercial property on the edge of a neighborhood that nobody else wanted yet. He rented it to a laundry business, then a pharmacy, then a dentist's office, and by the time I was born in 2001, that first building had become 4. Carmen ran the books. She kept ledgers in a handwriting so precise it looked typeset. She never missed a payment, never missed a deadline, and she did not believe in partners. What they built, they kept. I grew up knowing the properties existed. Abuelo would drive me past them on Sunday afternoons, just the two of us in his old truck, windows down, Spanish radio crackling through one working speaker. He would point to a building and say, "That one is the pharmacy block, Mija. You see how the corner faces the intersection? That is why it works." He taught me to look at a building the way he looked at everything, practically, patiently, like something that could either become useful or stay useless depending on what you decided to do with it. He never rushed those drives. He wanted me to see what he had built before he explained why it mattered. If you've ever been in a family where the people closest to you smiled at your face and made decisions behind your back, you know exactly the kind of quiet I'm describing. Stay with me because what happened next took me 5 years to fully see. By the time I was 14, I was spending Saturday mornings with Abuela Carmen going through the rental ledgers. Not because anyone asked me to. Because I asked her. She handed me a pencil and a yellow legal pad and told me to find the error she had deliberately placed on page 3. It took me 40 minutes. When I found it, a transposed digit in the March deposit column, she smiled and said, "Good. Now you know what you are looking for." My younger sister, Renata, was 3 years younger than me and uninterested in anything that required sitting still with a ledger. My parents, my father Ernesto and my mother Pilar, were supportive of my relationship with my grandparents in the way that people support something they believe is harmless. They smiled when I talked about the properties. They asked no follow-up questions. What I didn't understand then, and what would take me years to see clearly, was that my parents had a different relationship with my grandparents' money than I did. I thought about it as something to learn. They thought about it as something to receive. My grandparents were not naive. Abuelo Rodrigo had watched enough of his own extended family to understand what inheritance did to people before it arrived. He and Carmen made their decision quietly, without announcement, on a Tuesday afternoon in March when I was 17. I was not present. I found out 6 months later, on my 18th birthday, when Abuelo sat me down after dinner, handed me an envelope and told me to open it. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Gerald Whitmore, on letterhead from a firm in Pasadena. The letter confirmed that a revocable living trust, the Cruz Family Education and Property Trust, had been established naming me, Valentina Cruz, as the sole beneficiary of 4 commercial properties in the San Fernando Valley, collectively valued at the time of establishment at approximately $4.2 million. The trust would become irrevocable and transfer fully to me upon my 18th birthday, which was today. If you've ever been handed something that changes the entire shape of your future in a single sentence, you know what it feels like when the room goes quiet before you've processed what you've read. I looked up at Abuelo. He was watching me the way he watched those buildings on Sunday afternoons, steadily, like he had already decided, and was simply waiting for the thing to settle into its right position. "You earned this by paying attention," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." That night, before I went to sleep, I called Gerald Whitmore's office and left a message asking if there was anything I needed to sign or confirm. He called me back the next morning. The trust was already irrevocable as of my birthday. The properties were mine. He explained what documentation I needed to complete at his office within 30 days. I showed up in 22 days. My parents were not mentioned in the trust documents. Not as beneficiaries, not as trustees, not as anything. I did not think about what that meant for another 5 years. The first time my father made clear what he actually thought about my inheritance, I almost missed it. That was how he operated. Ernesto Cruz did not raise his voice. He did not make accusations. He made small, precise adjustments to the temperature of a room until you were cold without being able to say exactly when the chill had started. It was a Sunday dinner about 2 months after my 18th birthday. My grandparents were there and Renata and my mother's sister, Tia Florencia, who visited every few months from Phoenix and ate with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had been thinking about Carmen's rice since the last visit. The table was loud and warm, and I had just mentioned casually in passing that I had met with Gerald Whitmore and completed my portion of the trust documentation. My father set down his fork. Not dramatically. Not with any particular force. He simply set it down on the edge of his plate with a small, deliberate click, and he looked at me with an expression that was not anger and was not warmth, but was something suspended precisely between the two. "You went alone?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Without asking anyone?" I looked at him. There wasn't anything to ask. Gerald handled everything. He just needed my signature. He folded his hands on the table. I kept my expression even. I waited. "These are family assets, Valentina." He said it the way someone says something they have rehearsed being calm about. "It would have been appropriate to bring someone with you." "Abuelo asked me to go," I said. "The trust names me." Gerald's office confirmed there was nothing for anyone else to review. My father picked his fork back up. "Of course," he said. "Of course he did." He said nothing else. The table kept going. Tia Florencia asked Carmen about the sofrito, and the conversation moved, and I watched my father return to his meal with the composed expression of a man who had simply filed something away. Later that night, after my grandparents had gone home and Renata had disappeared into her room, I was in the kitchen washing the serving dishes when my mother came in and stood at the counter beside me. She didn't pick up a dish. She just stood there for a moment, and then she said, "Your father worries about you, you know. Taking on that much responsibility so young." I kept my hands in the water. "I've been learning the properties since I was 14, Mom." "I know," she said. "I know that. We just think it might have been nice to be included. As a family." I turned off the faucet. I folded the dish towel and set it on the counter before I answered. "Abuelo included me. That was his choice to make." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded once and left. That was the first one. Looking back now, I can see it for what it was, a probe. My father was checking whether I understood what I had, whether I was attached to it, whether I would be easy to redirect. My answer, calm, direct, citing Abuelo's authority, told him something he did not want to know. He waited 3 months before he tried again. The second incident happened at my parents' house, a Saturday afternoon in November. I had come over to drop off some paperwork Abuela Carmen had asked me to bring, a copy of a vendor contract for one of the properties. My father was home alone. I found him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what looked like a stack of financial statements. He waved me in without looking up. "Leave it on the counter." I set the folder on the counter. I was about to leave when he said, "Sit down a minute." I sat. He pushed the financial statements to one side and folded his hands on the table. He looked at me the way he looked at everything he was preparing to negotiate, like he was doing the math in his head and had already reached a number he found acceptable. "You know," he said, "your abuelo meant well. He always means well." He paused. "But he built those properties in a different time. A different market. What works for a 70-year-old man who has been managing the same 4 buildings since 1985 is not necessarily what's going to work for a 23-year-old who has a whole life ahead of her." I looked at him. "They're not performing badly," I said. "The occupancy rate across all 4 properties is 91%. The March vacancy on the Reseda block filled in 6 weeks. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had expected this answer and had prepared for it. "I know you know the numbers, Mija. That's not what I'm saying." He leaned back. "What I'm saying is there are opportunities out there. Bigger opportunities. For someone your age, sitting on a static portfolio of mid-century commercial buildings is not necessarily the smartest use of those assets. There are people who could help you grow that." "People," I said. "Advisors. Developers. People who know how to move capital." I squared the folder on the counter beside me before I answered. "I'm not interested in moving the assets," I said. "I'm interested in managing them well." He held the smile for another moment. Then it faded slowly, like something cooling. "You sound like your grandfather," he said. "Thank you," I said. I left. I sat in my car in their driveway for a full minute before I started the engine, my hands loose on the steering wheel, my pulse settling back to something normal. It was not what he said. It was how certain he had been that I would be interested. As if the conclusion had been so obvious that he had simply been waiting for me to catch up. That was when I understood that my father did not think I owned those properties. He thought I was holding them. What I am about to describe did not happen in a single year. It happened across 5 years, and I did not see the shape of it until I was standing at the end of it looking back. My father had worked in commercial real estate adjacent businesses his whole adult life. Not as a developer, not as a property manager, but as a loan broker. He connected buyers with lenders, took a fee, moved to the next deal. He had an office in Encino with his name on the door. He had never worked directly with my grandparents' portfolio. Carmen did not use loan brokers. She bought outright or not at all, which was a philosophy my father had described, on more than one occasion, as old-fashioned thinking. The first thing I remembered when I finally started to look back at all of it clearly was a conversation from when I was 15. I had been talking about one of the properties, the one on Reseda Boulevard, the largest of the 4, and I had mentioned something Abuelo had told me about the original acquisition price and how the land value had compounded. My father had listened, and then he had said with the same careful lightness he always used, "You know, Mija, your grandfather got lucky with timing. It's not really something you can replicate." I had nodded and moved on. I was 15. But I filed it. The second memory came from the summer I was 19. I had just finished my first full year of managing the tenant communications for 2 of the 4 properties, handling renewal notices, coordinating with the maintenance contractor Carmen had used for 12 years, forwarding complaints that needed escalation. I mentioned to my parents at dinner that one of the tenants on the Canoga Park property had renewed for 3 years at a 4% increase, above what we had projected. My mother said that was wonderful. My father nodded and said, "Good. Make sure you're not leaving money on the table. Have you had anyone else price the space?" I told him the space had been continuously occupied for 8 years by the same tenant and that losing them would cost more than a higher rate would gain. He nodded again, the same way he always nodded when he had chosen not to argue. "Just something to think about," he said. I thought about it. I kept the tenant. By the time I was 20, I had taken over full management of all 4 properties under Carmen's supervision. This meant I negotiated and executed 4 lease renewals in that year alone, across 3 different properties, without losing a single tenant. I identified a maintenance liability on the Reseda property, a drainage issue behind the eastern retaining wall that the previous contractor had missed, brought in a structural engineer for an independent assessment, and resolved it for $62,000 before it became a foundation problem that would have cost 4 times that. I sourced a new maintenance contractor when Carmen's original vendor retired, ran a 3-bid process, and selected a firm that came in 12% under the previous year's maintenance average with equivalent response times. I managed the transition when the pharmacy tenant on the Van Nuys property changed ownership mid-lease, navigating the assignment clause, running it through Gerald Whitmore's office, and completing the transfer without interruption to the rental stream. I kept the books the way Carmen had taught me, handwritten ledger, transferred to a spreadsheet, reconciled against the bank statements every month. I never missed a reconciliation. During those same 5 years, my father made 3 separate suggestions about the portfolio. The first was in the year I turned 20, when he mentioned casually over dinner that he had a client interested in acquiring commercial properties in the valley and that the Canoga Park building in particular would be attractive to the right buyer. I told him the property was not for sale. He said he understood, he was just passing it along. The second was when I was 21. He called me, not my grandparents, me, and said he had been connected with a development group looking at assembling parcels in the Reseda corridor. They might be interested in optioning the Reseda property for a preliminary study. The option fee would be meaningful and there was no obligation to sell. I told him I would not option the anchor property for a preliminary study by a group I had never met. He said he understood. The third was a conversation I did not know about until later. Carmen's health had been declining since I was 21, a slow narrowing of her range, the way a river changes in a dry year. By the time I was 22, she had given me full signature authority on all 4 properties. My father knew this. Abuelo was sharp as ever but now 79, and with Carmen stepping back he began to rely more on what the people around him told him. He was not impaired. He was simply, as he had always been, a man who built things and then trusted the people he loved to tend them. My father understood that too. The call came on a Wednesday morning in October. I was at my desk in the small office I had converted from a spare bedroom in my apartment, 2 monitors, the filing cabinet with the property folders color-coded by address, the shelf above the desk where I kept the original copies of the trust documents in a locked archival box. I had been reviewing the Q3 rent roll for the Van Nuys property when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I answered. Ms. Cruz? A man's voice, businesslike, with the particular efficiency of someone who made a lot of calls and did not expect most of them to require more than 3 minutes. This is David Ellison from Meridian Capital Partners. I'm calling as a courtesy. We've recently entered into a letter of intent with Mr. Ernesto Cruz regarding the commercial portfolio he brought to our attention, and we want to confirm the title chain before we move forward with due diligence. I did not move. My hand was still on the mouse. On the screen, the Q3 rent roll sat open, the numbers perfectly aligned, everything in order. I'm sorry, I said. Can you say that again? He said it again in slightly different words. His firm had been in conversations with my father. My father had represented himself as a principal with authority to negotiate on behalf of the portfolio. A letter of intent had been signed. They were preparing to enter due diligence on all 4 properties, with a proposed acquisition price of $6.8 million. All 4. My throat tightened. I kept my voice level. Mr. Ellison, I said, my father has no authority to negotiate on behalf of that portfolio. The properties are held in an irrevocable trust. I am the sole beneficiary and the sole authorized signatory. My father has no ownership interest and no agency relationship with the trust. There was a pause on his end. The kind of pause that means someone is recalibrating. I see, he said. I wasn't aware of that. Mr. Cruz represented. I understand what he represented, I said. I'd like you to send me everything he gave you. The letter of intent, any supporting documents, any representation letters. Can you do that today? Another pause. I think we should probably loop in legal before. Mr. Ellison, I said, if your firm has entered a letter of intent to acquire assets that the signatory had no authority to convey, you have a problem that legal counsel will want to know about immediately. I am asking you to send me the documentation so I can assess the situation. That is in both of our interests. He sent it within the hour. I sat at my desk and read through everything twice. The letter of intent was 4 pages. It listed all 4 properties by address. It named Ernesto Cruz as the authorized representative of the Cruz family property holdings, a name that did not exist. There was no mention of the trust. There was no mention of Gerald Whitmore. There was a signature line signed by my father dated 11 days ago. Attached to the letter of intent was a 1-page summary document describing the portfolio, occupancy rates, lease terms, maintenance history, all of it correct to within rounding. Someone had done real homework. Someone had access to information that should not have been available to anyone outside the trust. I called Gerald Whitmore's office. His assistant put me through in 4 minutes, which was faster than usual, and I recognized from the speed of it that something in my voice had communicated urgency without my intending it. I told Gerald what I had. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet I heard the particular quality of a very experienced attorney encountering something that did not surprise him as much as it should have. Valentina, he said, the trust is irrevocable. Your father cannot convey those properties. Any letter of intent he signed is unenforceable. Legally, you're protected. I know, I said. That's not what I'm asking about. Then what are you asking? I looked at the signature on the letter of intent. The handwriting was neat, unhurried, completely sure of itself. I'm asking how far along this has gotten, I said. And I want to know who else knew. Gerald asked me to come in the next morning. I told him I would come in that afternoon. I arrived at his office at 3:15. Gerald Whitmore was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had the particular stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms where people were trying not to show how much they needed him. He had a copy of the letter of intent on his desk, already printed and annotated in pencil. He walked me through what he had determined in the 3 hours between my call and my arrival. The letter of intent had been in circulation for 11 days. Meridian Capital Partners was a legitimate development firm. The proposed price, $6.8 million, was below current market, which made sense if the seller was motivated to move quickly. No completed purchase agreement. No earnest money had changed hands. But there was something else. 3 weeks before the letter of intent was signed, Gerald had received a phone call from another attorney, a man named Philip Okafor, representing my parents, requesting a copy of the trust document for family planning purposes. Gerald had declined on the grounds that the trust document was privileged to the beneficiary. He mentioned it now. They knew the trust was irrevocable, Gerald said. He folded his hands on the desk. That call from Okafor's office tells me they had already tried to access the document through proper channels and been refused. What happened next was not a misunderstanding about ownership. It was a decision made with knowledge. I sat with that for a moment. Outside Gerald's office window, the afternoon light was going flat and orange, the San Fernando Valley doing what it always did at this hour, sprawling under a sky that looked mild and went on forever. My sister, I said. Is her name on anything? Gerald checked his notes. Not on the letter of intent. But the summary document, the portfolio overview your father provided to Meridian, the formatting matches a spreadsheet I've seen before. The way the occupancy data is presented. The column labels. He turned the page toward me. I looked at the column labels. They were Carmen's. The exact labels Carmen had taught me to use when I was 14, sitting at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Someone had given them a copy of the working files. I called my father that evening and asked him to come to Gerald Whitmore's office the following afternoon. I did not tell him why. I said there was a matter involving the trust that required his presence, and that Gerald had requested it. My father said he would be there at 2 o'clock. He arrived at 2:03, which was early enough to signal that he took it seriously and late enough to signal that he was not going to appear eager. He was wearing a jacket I recognized, dark gray, well-pressed, the one he wore to meetings he considered important. My mother was with him. That surprised me for approximately 4 seconds, and then it didn't. Renata was not there. I had not expected her to be. Gerald's conference room was small and deliberately neutral, a round table for chairs, no window that faced the street. My father sat across from me. My mother sat beside him. Gerald sat to my left. There was a legal pad in front of Gerald and a folder in front of me and nothing in front of my parents, which was its own kind of information. My father looked at the folder. Then he looked at me. He smiled, the same measured smile from every kitchen table conversation across 5 years, and said so. What's this about, Mija? I opened the folder. I slid the letter of intent across the table and placed it in front of him. He looked at it. His expression did not change. That was the thing I noticed first. He did not react the way a person reacts when they are surprised. He reacted the way a person reacts when they have been waiting to see which document would appear first. I've seen this, he said. I know, I said. You signed it. I signed it as a representative of the family's interests. Dad. I kept my voice even. The trust is irrevocable. It has been irrevocable since my 18th birthday. You are not a trustee. You are not a beneficiary. You have no standing to represent those assets in any capacity. You know this because your attorney called Gerald's office 3 weeks ago and tried to obtain a copy of the trust document, and Gerald declined. My mother's hands moved in her lap. My father held the smile for one more moment, and then it dropped, not dramatically, not with any visible anger, but simply the way a mask comes off when the person wearing it decides the performance is over. We were trying to help you, he said. $6.8 million. Do you understand what that number means? You are 23 years old and you are sitting on dead assets. The properties generated $412,000 in net rental income last year, I said. That is not a dead asset. It is compared to what a proper sale and reinvestment could. Gerald, I said. Gerald opened his legal pad and placed a second document on the table. It was a 1-page summary prepared by his office that morning, outlining the legal exposure my father had created by signing a letter of intent to convey assets he had no authority to convey, representing himself as an authorized principal to a third-party buyer, and providing proprietary trust documents, the working spreadsheets with Carmen's column labels, to that buyer without authorization. My father looked at it. My mother looked at it. This is a civil matter, Gerald said. His voice was the same temperature it always was, which was the temperature of something that had been left in a cool room for a long time. It does not need to become anything more than that. But that depends entirely on what happens next. My father leaned back in his chair. He looked at Gerald, then at me, then back at Gerald. You're serious. Completely, Gerald said. We were going to split the proceeds, my mother said. Her voice was quiet and had a quality I had not heard from her before, something stripped of its usual warmth, like a room with the furniture moved out. The plan was to give you your share after closing. We weren't taking it from you. I set my pen down on the table before I answered. Mom. The plan was to sell my assets without my knowledge or consent, take a broker's fee, Dad's fee, and present me with whatever remained after the transaction was complete. That is not splitting proceeds. That is taking a cut of something that was never yours to cut. She looked at the table. How did you get the spreadsheets? I asked. I looked at my father. Carmen's files. The ones with her column labels. Those were in the trust's working folder. Who gave them to you? My father said nothing. Which was its own answer. Renata had a key to my grandparents' house. She visited on Thursdays. Carmen had started napping in the afternoons. I let the silence hold for a full beat. Then I said, here is what is going to happen. Meridian Capital Partners has already been informed that the letter of intent is unenforceable and that the signatory had no authority to execute it. Gerald's office is sending a formal notice to Philip Okafor's firm today. You will sign a document confirming you have no claim, standing, or interest in any of the 4 properties. You will not approach any buyer, developer, or financial intermediary on behalf of this portfolio again. And if anything involving these properties reaches my desk that traces back to either of you, we move from civil to criminal referral. My father looked at me for a long moment. His face had the particular quality of a man who had spent 5 years believing he understood a situation, and had just learned he had misread the central variable. You've been ready for this, he said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a compliment. Yes, I said. He signed the document Gerald had prepared. My mother signed it too, her handwriting smaller than usual, pressed into the page like she was trying to make herself take up less space. Neither of them spoke again before they left. My grandparents came to Gerald's office 2 days later. I had called Abuelo the evening after the meeting and told him what had happened. He had listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything serious, and when I finished he said, I know, Mija. I had begun to suspect. They came on Friday. They sat at the same round table. Gerald had the signed document in front of him. Carmen had her hands folded on the table, her posture as straight as it had ever been. Abuelo sat beside her and looked at me with the steady, unhurried attention he had always given me, on those Sunday drives in the truck pointing at buildings. I had written out what I wanted to say, not because I needed the notes but because putting things in order on paper helped me trust that I would say them in the right sequence. I looked at my father's empty chair for a moment, and then I looked at my grandparents and I said, I want to tell you what the last 5 years actually were. Not what they looked like from the outside. When I was 20, Dad told me the Canoga Park property would be attractive to the right buyer. I said it wasn't for sale. He said at the time, I'm just passing it along. What he was doing was finding out which building I would defend first. When I was 21, he called me, not you, me, about a development group looking at the Reseda corridor. He said the option fee would be meaningful and there was no obligation. What he meant was, let me introduce a buyer to the anchor property and see if she hesitates. When I was 22, he obtained a copy of Carmen's working spreadsheets without asking either of us. He waited until Carmen's Thursday nap and sent someone with a key. I paused. Carmen's hands tightened slightly on the table. She did not look away. Every time he said I was sitting on dead assets, he was describing something he wanted to liquidate. Every time he said he was thinking about my future, he was calculating his fee. Every time he said I was too young to understand the opportunity, I was in this office, or at a property, or on the phone with a contractor, doing the work he said I wasn't old enough to do. The drainage repair on Reseda, $62,000, I caught that because I was paying attention to a property he thought should be sold. The Canoga Park 3-year renewal at 4% above projection, I negotiated that myself. The Van Nuys ownership transfer, I ran that through Gerald without a single interruption to the rent stream. I did those things while he was telling buyers I wasn't managing the portfolio, I was just holding it. Abuelo reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Carmen looked at Gerald. What do we need to do to make sure this cannot happen again? Gerald walked her through it. a formal notification to Meridian, the signed renunciation document from my parents, and a recommendation to add a clause to the trust's administrative records explicitly naming the sole authorized signatory and prohibiting representation by any third party without written consent. Carmen nodded at each item with the focused attention of a woman who had been keeping ledgers since before my father learned to spell his own name. The fallout came in the weeks afterward, the way fallout always does, not in a single wave but in the slow structural way that a family reorganizes itself around a damage it has decided not to discuss directly. Tia Florencia called me from Phoenix and said only that she was sorry. Renata did not call. My mother sent a text 3 weeks after the meeting that said I hope you know we love you, and I read it twice and did not reply. My father did not contact me at all. Abuelo called every Sunday. Same as always. It has been 14 months since that afternoon in Gerald's conference room. The 4 properties are still mine. The Reseda building renewed its anchor tenant in the spring, a medical imaging group that signed a 7-year lease, the longest term in the portfolio's history. The Van Nuys property brought in a new tenant in February, a physical therapy practice that had been looking for that specific footprint for 2 years. Carmen reviewed the lease terms from her kitchen table, pencil in hand, and found one clause she wanted tightened. We tightened it. What I know now is that the work was the answer to all of it. Not as revenge, what I felt sitting across from my father was not satisfaction but something quieter. It was more like the feeling of having finished a very long calculation and finding that your original number was correct. The work had always been the point. The ledgers, the lease negotiations, the maintenance contractors, the drainage repair I found because I was paying attention. None of that was preparation for a confrontation. It was just what the job required. The confrontation was simply the moment when the record of the work became visible to everyone in the room. The hardest part was not my father. The hardest part was the version of my mother who stood in the kitchen the night of my 18th birthday and said your father worries about you. I have thought about that sentence many times. I have thought about how much of what we call family is actually a set of agreements about who gets to be protected and who is responsible for doing the protecting, and how those agreements are almost never written down and are almost never fair. My grandfather came to this country with $40 and a cousin's address. He built something because he paid attention and he did not stop. He gave it to me because he trusted what he had seen over 17 years of Sunday drives. That trust, the legal one, the one in the archival box, was just the document. The real thing was what he handed me when he put a pencil in my hand at 14 and told me to find the error. I found it. If this story made you think about the people in your own life who underestimated you, or the work you have been doing that nobody has been counting, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. All characters, names, events, and circumstances depicted are entirely imaginary and do not represent any real individuals or situations.